Hello and welcome back. Today we'll be discussing an article from 1999. Oh my god, this is from before Brody Spurlock was born. Right. So from the title of the video, we're going to be talking about the beatdown. Who that is, what that is, why that is. The beatdown is a concept that was born of Magic the Gathering, a game for nerds ages 13 plus, in an article written for The Dojo, a since out-of-business Magic website that housed tons of Magic's earliest and most renowned articles. The article in question, written by Mike Flores, breaks decks down into two roles, the aggressor and the controller. The concept is, if you know who the aggressor is and who the controller is, you have a much higher chance of winning the game. And conversely, misassigning those roles will cost you the game. And this is not something that's unique to Magic and card games, by the way. When you start looking at this dichotomy of aggressor versus defender, you can find it in all sorts of competitive and non-competitive gaming. In fighting games, for example, there's something called neutral, where neither you nor your opponent are actively attacking or actively defending. Functionally, this is the stage where you're both figuring out who is the beatdown. In this SF6 clip, the beatdown is clearly going to be JP. He has superior range and can just sit back and poke Zangief out of the game. If Zangief thinks he's the beatdown, misassigning the roles, that's a quick ticket to death. So he's going to defend until he finds an opening. Starting to sound familiar yet? Also, if you haven't watched Snake Eyes on Zangief, it's incredible. Go watch this finals after this video. Let's do another one. In adventure games like Breath of the Wild or Dark Souls, where you're fighting a large number of enemy types and you're trading blows and every hit counts, figuring out who is the beatdown can help you figure out when you have the space to deal damage. If the boss is winding up for a big attack, you're the beatdown, because he's setting up. Then he becomes the beatdown when he actually fires the attack, and you should probably block or dodge or something, not attack. And another one. In competitive Pokemon, the beatdown can loosely be determined by who has the more aggressive team, one that's designed to take one-hit knockouts early and often, versus one that has more controlling elements, so defensive, slower Pokemon that distribute status effects, etc.
Static! Are you kidding me?
As you can see, this concept's not new, and we have this in Fab too, obviously. In every meta, there's going to be aggro decks like Phi or Lexi, and this is every meta since the dawn of time in competitive gaming. In the new meta, fresh metas, people want to see what the fastest deck is, what does the most damage, what is the most consistent in taking an opponent from full to zero. And as more people start playing the faster decks, controlling strategies or strategies that want to bide their time or strategies that match well into those fast decks will show up, like Oldhim, Icelander, and Tree Frog Dash. This is why we have something like Fatigue Briar winning Nationals, right? So based on that, you'd think it would be pretty easy to figure out who the beatdown is based on deck choice alone. And we're going to see examples of that later when I talk through my top 8 streamed match against Dash.io at battle-hardened Pittsburgh. At that point, we'd just seen Thomas Dowling put on a clinic at calling Melbourne, going 13-0 before finally losing in the finals, right? People were streaming this deck. They were hyping it up. The damage numbers were crazy. So going into the tournament, I knew I wasn't going to be able to match Dash.io's damage output. So the moment my opponent sits down, says, "Hi, I'm on Dash.io," I already know that I'm not the beatdown in that matchup. That's a pretty easy example. Sometimes the question is harder to answer. So let's say we're both playing aggressive decks like Phi or Katsu or Dash.io. Does this mean that one of us needs to pretend to be a fatigue deck? No, absolutely not. However, in these types of similar deck versus similar deck matchups, it is much more important to figure out who the beatdown is. It's going to give you a much higher chance of winning, and it's why I've only lost the Rhinar Mirror twice, ever. So let's talk about how to figure that out in Fab. The beatdown is evaluated on a turn-by-turn basis. By understanding your deck, your opponent's deck, that's their damage output, their disruptive elements, their defensive capabilities, as well as your own, you'll have a better idea of when you should be attacking, i.e. you're the beatdown, or blocking, you're not the beatdown. Mike Flores highlights in his article the nuances that you have to consider when you're playing in these similar deck versus similar deck matchups. This is why tempo is so important in Flesh and Blood. We only have one game to decide a victor, so if your opponent has chosen to go second, it's likely that they've decided to be the beatdown, at least in the early game, because that means they're getting the first opportunity to attack you when your cards actually matter. From his article, these are some concepts you should be considering when evaluating what role you need to play. Obviously, this article is written with Magic in mind, but we can tailor it to Flesh and Blood. Who has more damage? This is still relevant for both games. Usually, the deck with more damage is the Beatdown. Who has more removal? This can be anything from, so removal, aside from us attacking dragons, poppers, attacking angels, allies, those kinds of things, removal isn't really a thing in Flesh and Blood. Instead, we have disruption, like CNC, or Erase Face, Amnesia, that kind of thing. A Censor, right? And other cards are more defensive, like Sink Below, Firewall, Fate Foreseen, that all you got. So that's, in this case, removal is more like a defensive package or disruption. And this is usually the Fatigue deck that'll have this, or at least the mid-range deck, the deck that is not the Beatdown. And lastly, who has more permission and card drawing? Mike Flores says it's almost always the control deck that's going to have more of this effect. However, in Flesh and Blood, what's interesting is this rule is usually the opposite. Whereas in Magic, if you're drawing a bunch of cards, this will usually get your counter spells up, your removal spells, your efficient creatures. In Fab, more cards usually translates to more aggression, since we have to use our hands every turn, otherwise we intellect penalty ourselves, right? We want to get through our deck faster. So more cards equals more death. In summation, if you are the Beatdown deck, you have to kill your opponent before they can kill you. That seems pretty obvious and a simple concept. But if you're the defensive deck, you have to weather the early Beatdown and get into a position where you can play your disruptive elements, right? If you assign those roles wrong, it'll likely lead to you losing the game. Keep these principles in mind as you play, and hopefully you notice points in the game where you've made mistakes and realize, oh, I wasn't the Beatdown and I should have blocked. Or, oh, I was the Beatdown, I should have attacked more instead of arsenaling that card. That kind of thing. Okay, so we've analyzed the article. Let's see this in action. I'm not going to show you the whole game that I played. You can check that out on Savage Feats. I'm going to point out several things that are related to the concept of the Beatdown. As we established earlier, I was already prepared for Connor to be the Beatdown for the entire game. Since his damage numbers were much higher than mine, and since Boost cannibalizes the Mechanologist's deck to give them above rate plays, I felt extremely confident going into the tournament that I could just fatigue her and block every single turn. It's critical at this point that I've taken out my Eye of Ophidia, since it's useless if my plan is to block out, and I've also taken out my Reckless Wings. You might go, why? Reckless Wings are a D-React, perfect for a defensive game plan. Not so! Typically, Reckless Wings are 4 points of value on block and 2 points of value on offense, and require 2 cards, for what ends up being 3 points of value each. Since I don't care about Dash.io's life total, functionally Reckless Wing turns 2 of my cards into block 2s, so they are out of the deck. If you end up watching the game, you'll notice that I'll intellect penalty myself several times just to avoid arsenaling a non-D-React card. The only thing I'm putting into my arsenal is D-Reacts, or a 0-cost card like Warmonger's Diplomacy. And since I'm running 3 Hold the Lines, which typically only block 2, I value keeping cards in hand that block 3, since that's less of a chance of me drawing the Hold the Line before I need it later. All of this is what led to this play, where Connor is able to have a huge turn, despite my usage of Scowling Fleshbag. I'm still able to fully cover up a dominated 12 damage max V threatening red boom grenade. Now, Connor has inevitably noticed that I am just sitting there, blocking, turn after turn after turn, right? He knows he's the Beatdown, but currently he's unable to set up enough damage to break through my defenses. So he starts taking setup turns. These are turns where he doesn't boost, so that he doesn't lose cards from his deck, and he can set up items so that his next turn is truly degenerate, right? It's easy to get locked into this concept of who's the Beatdown and then become inflexible to change as the game goes on. Every single time Connor gave me room to breathe, I was either setting myself up with a D-React in Arsenal to counteract his bigger turns, or throwing a disruptive card with damage, because on his setup turns, I become the Beatdown, since he needs as many of his cards as possible to damage me. This ultimately ends up with him giving me enough space to blood rush him in the endgame for lethal, as he's setting up for another monstrous turn, so I don't actually end up decking him out here. And that's that. Hopefully this video was of help to you. I had a great time making this one. It was really fun to get a little creative and spicy with the edits. If you like these videos, please let me know and let's meet up at an event sometime. Until then, Brute need nap. Brute think too hard.